Good afternoon. My name is Diego Delio Snyder, and I serve as the Managing Director of the Aspen Institute Latinos and Society program. On behalf of our advisory board and Aspen Latinos team, I would like to welcome you to today's Digital Success Masterclass. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I want to cover some housekeeping notes. This masterclass will be from noon to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. It will feature a listen-only modality and will be recorded for posterity purposes. Our team will send a link to the video recording in the coming days. This masterclass is meant to be an engaging platform for learning. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be answered after the panel discussion. Additionally, available resources and links will be shared throughout the discussion in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. As a way of background, the Aspen Institute Latinos and Society program is one of 40+ policy programs at the Aspen Institute. Our work focuses on empowering and promoting long-term economic growth and resilience in Latino communities throughout the United States. We focus on Latino entrepreneurship, workforce development strategies through digital success, and leadership development. The masterclass is a series of capacity building, virtual education seminars with the goal of equipping local leaders with the resources, networks, and knowledge to foster wealth building in their communities. Today's masterclass focuses on funding opportunities to expand digital equity. Experts will discuss current federal investments to bridge the digital divide and opportunities for national and local community organizations to engage in these efforts. Now, I would like to introduce Juan Otero, SVP for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Comcast Corporation, where he leads DE&I initiatives across Comcast NBC Universal, focusing specifically on governance, public policy, and strategic employee engagement. Juan is also an Aspen Latinos Advisory Board member and the co-chair of the Aspen Latino Digital Success Task Force, a brain trust of cross-sector leaders that aims to inspire action by companies, workforce organizations, and elected officials to better support the Latino community in transitioning to an increasingly digital workplace and business environment. Juan will provide introductory remarks to today's panels. Juan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, my friend. It's an honor to be here today. I'm excited to introduce this panel of incredible, excuse me. There we go. Pardon me. All right, let me start off again. Thank you, Diego. I'm sorry, a little bit of a technical difficulty. I'm excited to be here with you all and introduce this important critical discussion with two passionate and knowledgeable leaders in the space of digital equity. You'll hear from Francella and from Amanda shortly. It's almost a truism at this point when we talk about the digital age and access to high-speed internet, the need for updated digital devices, digital skills development. They're all critical and essential to succeed. Comcast is proud to support the work of organizations such as the Aspen Institute Latinos in Society program, as well as the National Skills Coalition, who work tirelessly and committed to providing digital equity for every American to succeed in this country. Let me start off a little bit of grounding in terms of some of the statistics, which I think probably won't be shocking to folks on this call, but it's important, I think, to ground the work. Latinos are, per the U.S. Department of Labor, projected to represent 78% of net new workers entering the U.S. labor market between 2020 and 2030. Further cementing, and I want to say further cementing, the role of Latinos as a key cornerstone for the future of the U.S. economy. Latinos also already represent 1 in 5 American workers, and investing in training and upskills for the Latino workforce is critical to ensure America's future prosperity and competitiveness. There cannot be a successful U.S. without having a digitally trained and successful Latino workforce, full stop. An important piece of scholarship and research done by the National Skills Coalition and Unidos US identified that Latino voters support government investment in skills development. Latinos are now the second largest voting age Americans, and estimated 17.5 million Latinos will cast a ballot in November. Really important stats there. Almost 75% of the Latino voters in the survey believe that expanding skills is necessary, is extremely or very important to improving the economy. Latinos also support a range of policies that expand high quality, inclusive skill training, including policies to support career pathways, industry partnerships, and data collection. These stats are evidence that the Latino community is willing to play a leading role in the future of America's economy. Uh, but to unlock that full potential, additional support is needed. That's why policies such as NTIA's Digital Equity Act programs represent a timely and important opportunity for community organizations with resources needed to expand access to digital skills training. To bridge this digital gap, a thorough understanding of community is critical. Using effective communications and language assistance to accommodate cultural and linguistic diversity must be part of the equation. It's very simple, it's very straightforward, but we must start at community. For these efforts to have the most impact, we must work with community organizations who are in the best position, frankly, to advocate for the needs and expectations of the communities they serve. And they can also amplify and deploy critical resources to support digital skills development. That's why I'm proud to say last year, Comcast awarded a total of more than $25 million to hundreds of community organizations to help provide the resources and support needed to build stronger, more equitable workforces. This masterclass, it's my hope, will inspire many of you to apply for time-sensitive federal funding opportunities meant to close the digital divide, such as the Digital Equity Competitive Grant. I fundamentally believe if community organizations are engaged and leverage this once-in-a-lifetime investments, and again, I'll say once-in-a-lifetime investments, we will be one step closer to bridging digital skills gap for good. I hope you have a productive and insightful sessions. Diego, you have curated a really great panel, and now I'm going to hand the mic over to you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Juan, for your intro remarks, and our appreciation goes to Comcast Corporation for the generous support of our work. Now I would like to get us started by framing today's masterclass. So as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic was a true eye-opener in terms of understanding the extent to which the digital divide was affecting America's society and economy. We all saw the pictures of children in parking lots next to McDonald's or other restaurants doing their homework because they didn't have proper connection at home. And we now understand that having good internet service, updated digital devices, but also access to digital skills training opportunities are essential in order to remain competitive and plugged into opportunities in our increasingly digitized world. Since the pandemic, we saw digitization becoming prevalent in spaces such as healthcare through telehealth, education with remote education opportunities. Even at work now, many companies have hybrid models or even completely remote job positions and opportunities. And then we also saw the expansion of e-commerce and a lot of business being done virtually. So not having access to digital spaces nowadays is as not having electricity a couple of decades ago. It truly became an essential utility. I also want to stress out that beyond having access to the internet and digital devices, digital skills are also essential in order for people to fully benefit from the digital economy. According to a 2023 study by the National Skills Coalition, and we have Amanda today who can go deeper into this topic, 92% of US jobs require some degree of digital skills. Basically, if someone looking for jobs do not have any kind of digital skills at all, they are not eligible for 92% of jobs in the market right now. We are basically talking about the difference between being hired or not. And yet, the National Skills Coalition also reported in 2020 that 31% of Americans aged 16 to 64 years old had little to no digital skills. And in the case of Latinos, this number raised up to 57%. So expanding access to digital skills training is essential, and some of the funding opportunities we will be discussing today are true bridges to ensure we can close that digital gap. Because of this context, from Aspen Latinos and Society, we developed the Aspen Principles for Latino Digital Success. which are a series of guidelines to inform the design and implementation of digital equity efforts targeting the Latino community. So I encourage all of you to access that resource. It has a series of guidelines for decision makers on the ground at the state and local level, but also a series of best practices that you can draw inspiration from, and a series of stats that you can also use when you are applying for grant opportunities. So I encourage you all to use that resource and to feel free to contact us if you have any questions. And now I would love to introduce our panelists for our great conversation today. I would like to invite Amanda and Francela to come on screen and to very briefly introduce themselves by sharing, well, who they are, where they are working, and what connection do they have with digital success and digital equity overall. So Amanda and Francela, all to you. Let's start with Francela.
Hi, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for the invite just to join this conversation. I've been a longtime fan of Aspen's work, and I'm really excited about the work that you guys have been doing specifically on digital equity. My name is Francela Chillo. I am now a longtime digital equity advocate, long before it was a federal priority. And so I was also working alongside many of the people who are tuned in for this workshop, working at nonprofit organizations to make sure that particularly historically overlooked communities, including Latino communities, Indigenous communities, Asian Americans, African Americans, people living with disabilities, all sorts of communities that really didn't get the attention they deserved when it came to broadband deployment. And so now that I am on the federal side of this equation, I run the Office of Public Engagement at NTIA. And so our office is responsible for deploying the $60 billion in Internet for All programs. And so that includes BEAD, middle mile, digital equity, and other things that go with that. So I welcome collaboration, I welcome ideas, and I just want to make sure that I emphasize that when I show up in these spaces, I am very aware of the work that it took, like literally the decades of work that it took long before I started doing this work for us to arrive at this moment. So when Juan was mentioning about how this is, historic, once in a generation funding, I'm very aware of the fact that it took us decades to get here and don't want us to miss an opportunity.
Thank you so much, Francela, for your words. I'll pass it on to Amanda for her to briefly introduce herself.
Well, it's an honor to be here today with you, Diego, and with Francela and Juan. I just want to build on what Francela was saying. Like, we are standing on the shoulders of ancestors who spent decades really advocating and pushing for not only the infrastructure, but an infrastructure that actually reached everybody and that didn't leave folks behind. And so now it's our responsibility to be lifting as we climb, as we are making sure that communities are part of these new federal investments. I'm Amanda Bergson-Chilcock. I am a senior fellow at National Skills Coalition. We are a big tent bipartisan coalition of workforce and education advocates. My particular areas of expertise are immigrant workforce development, adult education, and digital skills. And I come to this work after having spent 9 years at a community-based nonprofit in Philadelphia, providing direct services to immigrants and US-born job seekers from all over the world. So it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And I just want to express our gratitude and how privileged we are to be able to hear these two amazing leaders in the digital equity space. So now I would like to let Francela get us started with a presentation on some of the incredible funding opportunities that are currently available to bridge the digital gap. Francela has a presentation for all of us, and we will start sharing soon. But basically, Francela will set up the tone for the conversation, and then we will have Amanda making a short presentation, and then we will have a short panel discussion before we get to your questions. So please stay tuned in. Francela, all to you.
Thank you so much for sharing these slides. And I did want to make sure that these slides aren't complete. This is really just a flavor of two of the programs in particular that you asked about for me to be able to focus on BEAD deployment and then also on digital equity. So I'll start with just giving you a little bit of background information because I do want to make sure that we aren't starting in the middle of the conversation for people who are new to this work. About 3 years ago, essentially, the bipartisan infrastructure law allowed for Congress to appropriate funding through NTIA for big tent programs that were to essentially achieve internet for all broadband deployment being deployed across the country, for people to make sure that areas that were traditionally overlooked, whether it be for having difficult geography or topography, maybe there was maybe no economic sense for certain companies to go there. Essentially, these programs were designed to get into the nooks and crannies of the entire country and to get to places where other people weren't able to go with service. And so moving on to the next slide, it yielded a program, which was the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. And very often people call it BEAD for short. So when you look at how this program lined up with other pieces of the Internet for All programs, it included BEAD, Digital Equity Program, tribal funding, and then also funding for middle mile infrastructure. I'll start going in reverse because middle mile infrastructure is not always the sexy part of the conversation, but it's very important that think of those as the central nervous systems of certain networks. And essentially it makes sure that areas can actually have end users, like essentially provides the networking necessary for us to get service from the end user, the endpoint providers that you normally are familiar with. So when you sign up for internet service, that might be different than who provides middle mile, but that middle mile backhaul infrastructure is a very important part of the overall central nervous system across the country. Then also $2 billion was set aside for tribal funding. Obviously, that was necessary and overdue. Tribal populations are actually some of the most disconnected populations in the country. And so this was money that was actually set aside to focus on deployments on tribal lands. And then digital equity funding, this was a first of its kind. $2.75 billion was allotted for that. And we'll get into details. And then the BEAD program, which is the biggest tranche of the Internet for All programs, allotted over $42 billion for broadband access deployment across the country. So moving on to the next slide to tell people a little bit of color about what's in BEAD. So essentially BEAD programming focused on sharing those funds, the $42 billion in funds, with states and territories across the country. So essentially that includes the 50 states, District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and other territories. So you'll see on this part of the chart, it tells you here's where the program was actually, like, the funds were actually sent or assigned. And then it actually tells you how people could use those funds in those places. So it could have been used for planning, deployment, installations, to boost adoption and affordability programs, and also workforce development and training. So just to give you a little bit of color about the process, states and territories had to submit to NTIA their strategy on how they were going to use their share of BEAD funding. So they were supposed to have some sort of community engagement where people within the state were able to actually give comments on how they thought that their state or territory should use those funds. At this point in the process, every single state and territory has turned in an initial plan. Almost all of the initial plans, we have only a few left, have been, they're passing through the phases of approval, and we're in volume 2s for most of those places. There are still opportunities for people to be involved and get involved, whether it's with the challenge process or to ask questions about what are the long-term plans for states and territories. So don't feel like just because you missed a deadline with the original planning doesn't mean that you don't have opportunities to continue to engage with your state broadband offices. So moving on to the next slide, one more note I wanted to give color about the BEAD program. Just we get a lot of questions about when those programs are passing through layers of approval and what does that actually mean for, like, when does the money actually go out the door? Every proposal, once it's submitted, has to actually show that they have a challenge process for people within that state to challenge the how the state or territory said that they were going to deploy. And then also there's going to be a subgrantee selection process where essentially people are able to challenge the things in that process. And then they have a final proposal. And once that final proposal is ready, then the disbursements will go to the state or territory. Moving on to the next slide, just to tell you a little bit about the digital equity grant programs. The digital equity grant programs, I'll tell you a little bit about the competitive grant program in particular, but I'll frame it with how that's actually one part of 3 major parts of the Digital Equity Act. So moving on to the next slide, you'll see that the Digital Equity Act introduction, just to make sure that you see, this was split into 3 parts. It had the state planning part, which is approximately $60 million that states and territories could use to construct a digital equity plan for their state or territory. The state capacity grant, that is money that is actually going to be filtered through the state for the state or territory to effectuate its own plan. And then we have the competitive grant program, which is for the people within the state to craft plans that essentially fill in the gaps for those state or territory capacity grant plans. So moving on to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about the competitive grant program. So I mentioned that there are 3 parts, and this is the 3rd tranche of money out of the Digital Equity Act. So when you look at that last block here where it says $1.25 billion has been assigned, this is the part where when I explain to people what's the difference between the competitive grant and the state capacity grant, the state capacity money is for the state to look at itself and think about all the different parts of the state that they need to fill in the corners that access isn't enough. They need to get in there and think about training, think about partnerships. Where do they need to collaborate? The competitive grant is for the people within that state to say, hey, you missed a spot. And that's where the people within those states and territories get to say, here's where we think that you need to fill in the gaps. Moving on to the next slide, when you get to the part, I get a lot of questions about what exactly is a covered population. So I do want to make sure that we are defining what that is, because essentially all of the Internet for All programs were essentially focused on touching covered populations, which have been historically overlooked. So when we see covered populations, it includes populations that are low-income households, aging individuals, individuals that are either incarcerated or touched by or justice impacted, veterans, individuals living with disabilities, individuals facing language barriers or who have low levels of literacy, racial and ethnic minority groups, and also residents that are living in rural areas. So all of these covered populations are important when we're thinking about what needs to be a target of digital equity competitive grant programs. So when we move on to the next slide, there's a few notes that I think I just want to make sure we emphasize for what is the spirit of the competitive grant program. It is essentially a program to help not only give communities better access to actually enjoy the benefits of technology. It's like I always used to tell people when I first started working on broadband access, when really a lot of people weren't talking about digital equity. It doesn't matter if you have high-speed connectivity in your neighborhood if you can't get it across the threshold of the front door of where you live. So if I have great service that's available in my neighborhood and I can't afford it or don't have a computing device, that doesn't mean anything for me because I don't get to experience the benefits of technology. So the competitive grant program is to support us making sure that everyone actually benefits. So that improves the quality of education, improving access to healthcare, improving social and civic engagement outcomes, also improving economic stability and workforce opportunities. So these are some of the things that are the main objectives of this program. So the question is, how are we going to get there? Moving on to the next slide, when you see some of the suggestions that are there, it's important that when you are tailoring grant program applications, that you focus on making sure that you are working in harmony with your digital equity capacity grant program for your state or territory, where you're looking for projects that are essentially filling in gaps or supplementing or making sure that we are reaching into places that maybe aren't as obvious to governments. Also, your programs should be promoting long, meaningful, lasting change. The reality is that these grant programs, whether it's through NTIA or you have a grant program that comes through a philanthropic organization, there is a distinct time limit on what those grants can do. But what people are looking for is to make sure that your projects are actually aimed at transforming communities, helping to lift up communities so that they can also help themselves. So think about how is your program or your project submission going to actually promote lasting, meaningful change in the communities that you are targeting. Also, you need to be able to measure the impact of your programs and also make sure that you have some sort of involvement to get stakeholder engagement. Moving on to the next slide, I think that one of the most important and frequent questions I get is about what exactly is included in the Digital Equity Competitive Grant Program. And I wanted to actually show you just some examples about what is called an allowable activity as defined in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. And that includes digital inclusion activities. It includes activities that promote actually adopting broadband. So that means actually promoting people getting service and keeping their service. Because one thing that we know, especially in households that are low-income households, you might be able to get service, but do you actually keep it all year round? That's a question mark. So programs that actually help make sure that people can not only afford to get online, but can stay online are part of that allowable activity umbrella. Also, you might be promoting access in a public access center, like a community center or a church. It might be to do a workforce development program. And I know that that's definitely been a focus for Aspen. So think about different ways that, and also you might be making computing devices available. So I wanted to just give you a few examples, but it's also really important that, quite frankly, you think about what's the work that you do really well. So don't let what's in a grant application shape what you do. That is something that actually gives you guardrails of what is eligible. I think you need to think carefully about what you're really good at and where's the contribution that you make to your community when you're crafting your application. Next slide. Just to make sure that you are thinking expansively about whether or not you want to apply individually or as a partner. Very often, if you are applying in partnership, that is something where you can essentially get a partner that helps fill in the gaps that maybe you don't have. For example, I worked at very small nonprofits. Being able to apply for a federal grant would have been a very big lift and it would have been hard. So I might have looked for a partner. And so think about if you are able to find a partner that can complement your work or at least help you expand the impact of your work and also maybe help you administratively be able to accomplish what you need to do to be in compliance with this grant. Lastly, I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned a couple of notes that were important to me when I read the notice of funding opportunities, that there is a cost sharing requirement that organizations, when you move on to the next slide, organizations must be able to meet the 10%. They must actually make sure that they are only asking for 90% of the total project cost, which means that essentially for a lot of nonprofits, you need to be able to show that you have 10% in the bank, at least in reserves, or a partner that can show that. Otherwise, you need to actually apply for an exception. And so I just want to make sure that that is clear to everyone, that that is something that if you are applying for example, a $10 million grant, you would need to make sure that you had 10% in the bank. And then lastly, a note about that I think is a really important part for people who are applying from nonprofits on the next slide is that it's important that you are able to measure your own impact. So you need to be able to say, what are the covered populations that your project will touch? What is the estimate of the individuals that it will serve? And are you able to do the storytelling to show quantitatively and qualitatively how your project makes an impact? So as a summary in the next slide, I do want to make sure that I just told you a couple of things just to keep in mind in terms of your step. Number one, there is no replacement for reading the notice of funding opportunity. There's no replacement. That is the best information. It's going to tell you what makes you out, what you need to show eligibility, what you need to actually submit with your project, how it's going to be evaluated. So these slide decks or any information you're getting from an organization, there is no superior information to the notice of funding opportunity. Also, make sure that you review, are you eligible, that you've signed up with sam.gov and done your paperwork, because the protocols of this, you need to make sure that your paperwork is submitted properly to be able to be eligible. And a few other notes, make sure that you're thinking about engaging with other stakeholders. Have you looked into your state or your territory's plan? Are you thinking about what are ways that you can not only complement work that's happening in your area instead of duplicating that work? And then finally, obviously reviewing your materials carefully, thinking carefully about your long-term strategy and making sure that it is submitted on time for the September 23rd deadline. The last slide that I will leave for you in the slide deck, this is for you to share. I just wanted to make sure that you knew that the application due date was on September 23rd and that these are a couple of notes that administratively we wanted you to keep in mind. But again, I'm so excited that you guys are even thinking about this process. I'm so excited about the fact that you've honestly poured yourself into this work if you're watching this webinar, and we really hope to get some of the most creative and extraordinary applications from across the country.
Thank you so much, Francella, for such a great presentation. And as you can all see, this is a very time-sensitive issue, and that's why we found it urgent to invite Francela and Amanda to discuss this topic. So we encourage all of you to access the NOFO and to also reach out to the NTIA if you have any questions. And now I would like to invite Amanda to come on camera. Because the National Skills Coalition has been developing a lot of great resources around the NTIA programs, both the Digital Equity and the BEAD program. They are, in general, big experts on anything workforce development. So they have a lot of great resources that can also be of support and help to any of you that are thinking of applying to these grants. So I'm gonna pass it on to Amanda now.
Great. Thank you so much, Diego. That was a whirlwind tour from Francella. And the one thing I want to emphasize is one of the last things she said, which is your best source for information about these funding opportunities is the official federal document known as the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity. That is the official source for what's allowed, what's not allowed, when it's due, what kind of matching funds you have to have, all that information. So I just want to encourage you, if you have not already accessed that document, to do so. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is walk quickly through 3 questions, just briefly reiterating the funding that's available, talk a little bit about how you as Latino-led and Latino-serving organizations can pursue this funding, and share some additional free data and resources from my organization that can help you make the case. So there are 3 major types of funding available that we're talking about today. These federal digital equity competitive grants that have a deadline of September 23rd, the state formula funding, which will be regranted to local organizations. And the deadlines for that really vary depending on your state. And in a minute, I'm going to link to the state plans so that folks can access their own state's information and see what those deadlines may be. And then, of course, every state is getting at least 100 million, and some getting many hundreds of millions of dollars, or even $1 billion in the case of states like Texas, to support the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. The BEAD funding goes first to state broadband offices, and it has just started to flow. The first handful of states have gotten their BEAD money. And then the states will turn around and grant that to BEAD subgrantees, who will mostly be internet service providers, but some of them may be municipal governments or local utility companies that are going to run broadband networks. And this is where the broadband workforce development puzzle piece comes in. And we'll talk more about that in a minute, but I know we already had a question in the chat about opportunities for labor unions to partner as part of apprenticeship programs for broadband tower technicians or fiber optic technicians. This is a great area for organizations that have an interest or a track record in workforce development. So I will talk more about that in a minute. So how can you, as an organization, start? Where do you start, right? This is a lot of information. It might seem kind of overwhelming. I think it's really important to be clear on what your vision for digital equity looks like. Perhaps your organization serves parents and children together. And so part of your vision for digital equity is around making sure that parents have the skills to help their kids with homework. Perhaps your organization is very focused on English as a second language classes. And so your vision for digital equity is about making sure that people who are fluent in languages other than English have opportunities to build their digital skills. Maybe your organization is a labor union or running apprenticeship programs, and that's really where your bread and butter is. Being clear on that will then help you when you look at the federal Notice of Funding Opportunity and your state plan, because then you'll know where your organization's assets and expertise are, and you won't be thrown off course by just kind of chasing after whatever seems popular or of interest. You can actually stand on your own 2 feet and prioritize what your organization really excels at and specializes in. So I do recommend that you look at your state digital equity plan, or if you're a national organization, look at the state plans for organizations that you are working in. You don't have to read the whole plan. You can do a control F find for elements of the plan that are most relevant to the work that you do, right? So if you do a lot of work helping people get access to digital devices, maybe you have a partnership with a computer refurbisher like an organization like PCs for People. Then look at the device section. If your focus is on skills and teaching people digital skills or digital literacy, you can look at that section. And I've listed the link here so that you can find where your state plan is publicly posted. You should also take a look at the workforce readiness section of your state's BEAD initial proposal. Now, this is a very big document, the initial proposal, but the workforce readiness section is probably only going to be about 3 to 6 pages long. Most states, that section is pretty short and sweet. So I'm not giving you a massive reading assignment here. Don't be too intimidated when you log on to this website and you say, oh gosh, my state's plan is, 295 pages long. If you do a keyword search for workforce readiness, you'll find that section, which is generally section 8 of everybody's proposal. And you can take a look at that handful of pages. And then think about how your organization's activities align with the priorities that your state has outlined. Now, remember, you saw this in Francella's slides too, your state is on the hook to talk about how digital equity funds will reach those covered populations. People who live in low-income families, people who are aging adults over the age of 60, people who are English learners, people of color. That's probably who your organization is serving. So there may be already some immediate overlap in terms of the communities you're serving, and then think about where there's overlap in terms of the activities that your organization is providing. Think also about your track record, right? I always say that relationships are not tapioca pudding, right? You don't just drop the instant pudding and add some water and say, boom, now we have a trusted relationship with communities. Your organizations have spent years or decades building relationships with community members who might not trust a government program or might be wary of a program that's run out of a larger mainstream organization. You speak the language, either literally or figuratively, of the communities you're serving. You're located in the neighborhoods of the places that you're trying to serve. And you have a long history of having served those communities. That's a huge asset. And don't be shy about bragging about that as an asset as you talk to your state partners about why they should consider you as a potential collaborator. And then once you've done that thinking, once you've kind of looked inward to your own organization and your own priorities and your own relationships, then reach out to your state broadband office and to potential partners to talk about your organization's areas of expertise. We have some materials from here at National Skills Coalition that may be helpful to you. We warmly encourage you to steal our charts and graphs. Please use them in your grant proposals, in your public presentations, in your relationship building meetings. Just credit National Skills Coalition and you're good to go. This is our report on the 43 million help wanted ads we analyzed to see the demand for digital skills. We also have public polling data about voters and their interest in digital skills, and particularly about Latino voters. So I've linked to that polling data on the slide here. We warmly encourage you again to use that data to make your case. And we also encourage you to use the short and sweet little 2-page fact sheets we've produced for about 20 states, including many of the states with the largest Latino populations, right? So we've done this for Florida, we've done this for California, we've done this for Virginia, a number of states where there are pretty robust communities of Latino families and workers. Here's an example of one of the public perspectives charts from our Latino voters polling. The yellow bars here represent all voters. The green bars represent Latino voters. And you can see that there's a strong interest on the part of Latino voters for collaborations between education and workforce organizations and businesses to help people train for jobs like broadband jobs that are in high demand. And then the last resource I want to share with you as a data resource is a report we did a couple of years ago that Diego referenced earlier, which is about the number of workers right now who have digital skills and those who still need to build them. And again, we encourage you to borrow charts and graphs. I'm going to stop sharing slides now because we're going to open things up for a broader conversation and discussion. I know some of you have already been adding questions in the Q&A in the button. I'm going to go ahead and drop the resource that I mentioned into the chat, which is, oops, I don't know that I have access actually to the full chat. I may answer it in the Q&A. The resource around telecommunications apprenticeships. Let me turn it back over to Diego.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And no worries, I've been sharing some of the resources on the chat myself. But of course, if I'm missing anything, feel free to drop it on the Q&A box. But as you can all see, there are quite a few opportunities going on at the same time. If you're interested in applying to the NTIA Digital Equity Competitive Grant, that's the one that has a deadline on September 23rd. So it's very time sensitive. We have less than a month ahead. But then there is also ongoing opportunities through the state governments. And as Amanda mentioned, and as Francella mentioned, it is a very critical resource that you all become familiar with the state digital equity plan to understand what the strategy is at the state level to address the digital divide, so that you can align your proposal either at the federal competitive grant or at the state grants with what is going on in your state. The more alignment you have with what's going on with at the state level, the stronger your application will be. And of course, we encourage all of you to check the resources Amanda was mentioning before in order to strengthen your application, strengthen your narrative, and basically make the case that you are a critical asset in this strategy because of the connections you have with the community. You are a trusted organization, the community trusts you, and you can become a bridge in order to address the digital divide. So before we go on to some of the Q&As that we have on the box, I wanted to very briefly ask a couple of questions to Francella and Amanda that I believe can be helpful to folks in attendance today. The first one is to Amanda. Amanda, you just mentioned broadband jobs, and I want to make sure that we clarify what do we mean by broadband jobs, because I know that part of your job in the last few months or last few years is ensuring that we get a better understanding that BEAD is not only creating jobs in the infrastructure and construction sector, but there are other additional opportunities. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, great question. So, and again, I do encourage you to read the workforce readiness section of your state's BEAD proposal, because some states, including Florida and Arkansas, have been really creative in explaining how they're thinking about broadband jobs. Broadband jobs include things like fiber optic technician or broadband tower technician, people who are literally helping to install and maintain the fiber networks that are bringing high-speed internet to many communities. But they also include customer service representatives, heavy equipment operators and construction managers, finance managers. They include cybersecurity workers, right? A huge area of focus for the federal government now is making sure that there is sufficient cybersecurity workers. Many of you may have seen in the news ransomware attacks against hospitals, against local governments, against energy utilities. And so there is an interest in training cybersecurity workers. And then generally speaking, other IT specialists and IT maintenance workers. A big focus of the BEAD program is getting community anchor institutions to have high-speed internet. So again, hospitals, public libraries, HBCUs, and other higher education institutions, right? How do we make sure that they not only have the fiber or the wires running to them, but have the workers needed to maintain those networks over the longer term. So when we think about broadband jobs, it really is that whole universe and not just that kind of more narrow set of occupations that you might more naturally think about.
Thank you, Amanda. And I also know that part of your work has been about the lack of representation in some of those broadband jobs. So ensuring that workers from our community get the training needed in order to leverage some of these opportunities is top of mind because many of these jobs are high paid, well paid, and they have high growth rates for the years ahead.
Absolutely. And to be absolutely honest here, there are a lot of older white Anglo men in these jobs right now. We don't have enough older white Anglo men in our entire workforce to fill all the jobs that we need to fill. It is an economic imperative to make sure that women and people of color are trained for and able to qualify for these good jobs. So yes, there is a kind of moral imperative and a justice imperative to say that people should have equitable opportunities for good family wage jobs. But honestly, there is also just a serious economic incentive.
Thank you, Amanda. I would like now to ask a question to Francela. I think it was Brent Wilkes from the Hispanic Federation that asked this on the Q&A box before. Basically, getting a sense on what is the difference between BEAD and digital equity regarding the workforce development piece, if there is any.
Okay, so just to clarify, I think the question was about between the state digital capacity grant program and the competitive grant program. So I just want to make sure. And so I put that in the chat that I wanted to make sure that I compared the language side by side. Although both grant NOFOs were similar, some of the line items are distinctly different. And so I want to make sure that I follow up with a precise answer on the exact what was the difference there. So I'll follow up with an answer to that. But I will say that in general, the ask about what we were asking, NTIA was asking of states and territories is very similar to what NTIA is asking of community-based organizations. For states and territories, they were saying, look, this is the first time that some of you even have a state broadband office. Because I do want to ground this in 3 years ago, there was only a handful of state broadband offices. So this is new. And the idea that some of them would actually be crafting digital equity strategies, that is also new because there are a lot of places that were seeing digital equity for the first time during COVID. So the planning grants gave them an opportunity to make a plan. The capacity grants gave them money to implement the plan. But the competitive grant is an acknowledgement that there are some parts of communities that governments are not designed to go. So nonprofit organizations, partners that are in the communities are able to fill in gaps that quite frankly might have either been overlooked or maybe under-resourced in a state capacity grant program.
Thank you, Francela. And my apologies, I haven't seen that you already replied to
Oh,
the
no
question
worries.
on the Q&A box. My next question, and I think this is a question by Aparna in participation today. Aparna is asking about the role that emerging tech skills may have in these grant opportunities, such as AI. And I believe this is a great question for both Francela and Amanda. Francela, from the perspective of the NTIA requirements, and Amanda, I know that the big chunk of your work has been about ensuring that digital skills training opportunities are not only on foundational skills, but also on industry-specific skills. So let's start with Francela at the overall requirements of the grants, and then we can pass it on to Amanda.
So maybe I'll start with saying that NTIA's programs are not anything that we have no direct relationship with the grantees. So the thing is, a community-based organization, other than actually applying for the grant, our job is administration, disbursement, compliance. That's what we oversee. Rarely does NTIA go into a community other than site visits and things like that to actually find out the impact of some of these things. So when we're talking about especially something like AI, which is honestly, when we're talking about AI, it's so big, there's so many parts, it's like so important. I think there are a lot of people in NTIA that acknowledge that's going to be an essential part of not only workforce development in terms of teaching people how to use it, making sure that people are digitally proficient and can actually use AI to their advantage to do whatever it is that they do better. But there are no grant programs that directly fund organizations or projects that promote AI. So I just want to be clear, those would have to be filtered through an organization, and the organization could state, this is our effort to make sure that we are promoting either workforce development or digital inclusion. And again, having to be one of the covered populations and being able to share, this is what we think is the necessary intervention in our community. But otherwise, there's no direct money from NTIA to do so.
Excellent, very clear. Thank you, Francella. Amanda.
Yeah, so three things I want to mention about AI. First, we did public polling on the question of AI and skills training, and I've shared that link in the chat with a webinar host, and she's putting that in the chat for everyone to see now. Secondly, there's a nonprofit organization that's doing some really interesting work on AI with a particular focus on Black and Latino workers, and that is the Caper Center. And some of you may already be familiar with their excellent work. And I have also shared their information for Yesenia to add to the chat. Highly recommend attending their public webinars and just seeing the work they're doing on this topic. But I think the most important takeaway, I would say, is if your organization is interested or concerned about how AI is affecting Latino adult learners and workers, you need to have a strong, clear vision about your organization's role in that conversation, and that will help you identify where there may be federal or state funding for you to actually be supported to go deeper into that work, right? So being really clear internally helps you then figure out, okay, if the thing we're interested in is training folks to be data scientists or training folks to be on ramps to a community college training program in AI, that will give you some sense of higher education funding to look at and pursue. The National Science Foundation has put out some grants. NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, is putting out some grants. If your question is, well, we are kind of like a nonprofit running our own in-house training program, like an organization called Perscalis or an organization called Can Code Communities, both of which are nonprofit organizations that train people how to code. There's also Code the Dream, which works a lot with DACA recipients and dreamers. If that's what your bread and butter is, then your conversation might be with the workforce development system to help them think about how to fund your organization to teach people artificial intelligence and related coding skills, right? So being really clear internally about what's the what you're trying to accomplish for the Latino communities you're serving will then help you figure out which of the federal agencies and opportunities that are out there, some of which are clearly labeled AI and some of which are not specifically designated that way, but could include AI, is really powerful. And I'll give one last example, right? The US Department of Agriculture is continually putting out different kinds of funding to support training for farm workers and training in precision agriculture. AI is part of precision ag, right? And so if that is something that your organization is interested in, you should be looking at what USDA is doing, right? And so, it can be overwhelming to think about going in all these directions at once, which is why, again, I recommend that you refocus on what is your organization's bread and butter? What are you proudest of? What are you best at? Where are your strongest relationships? And go from there.
Thank you very much, Amanda. We're running out of time, but I see a follow-up question from Brent on the piece between BID funding and digital equity. Brent is asking, much from the BID funding will be used to build out broadband. However, in your presentation, the states can use some of the BID funds for adoption and workforce and training. Could those programs be similar to those that will be funded by the digital equity programs? And maybe, Francella, this will require some follow-up. So just wanted to read out the question in case you have an answer, but we can definitely follow up, of course.
And yes to both, because I'll also follow up with specifics. But thank you so much for clarifying that, Brent, because I didn't understand that from the other Q&A question. So just to clarify, if a state is saying we have a population of whether it's whether it's older adults, and we are creating workforce development for this specific population in this zip code, right? And they say that they don't have broadband. For whatever reason, maybe it's low income, there's other things, because again, the covered populations are intersectional. The state might prioritize in their BEAD planning to fund broadband deployment in a place that actually effectuates a workforce development program. So it isn't that they were designing a workforce development program. It might be that the actual deployment is in service of the program that ends up helping people through training. But the reason why you are doing it, you're acknowledging you don't have the actual broadband access. So the thing is, it's not necessarily a digital equity program, because there might be a reason that they've decided we need to make sure that we need to deploy in this area. And it is also in service of a program that would have qualified under digital equity. So it is not, but you can't have something that is duplicative. So you have to show that these are serving different purposes. There are going to be some things that overlap. So for example, you might have BEAD programs that actually fund deployment, and you might have other people that are funding digital equity programs in that same zip code on that same block. So there are some things that are duplicative in that way in terms of not duplicative, but I'd say that they're actually complementary. But if it is to do the same exact thing, you couldn't use funding, whether it's NTA funding or even FCC funding, to do something that would be duplicative. So I just want to, I'll put a finer point on it when I follow up, but I just want to acknowledge that there are some BEAD programs that actually theoretically do support things that could have otherwise qualified under digital equity. But at the time that the BEAD was crafted, the point of BEAD is to focus on deployment. The point of the digital equity programs is to focus on promoting adoption and workforce development.
Super clear. Thank you, Francella. So we're almost at time. I would like to ask our great panelists today to provide a 1-minute final thought to share with our attendees today. So let's start with Francella.
Well, thank you again for just having this conversation and digging into this work. If it's one thing that there's 2 things maybe I'll share, is that the first thing is, it's okay if grant programs, if this isn't the thing you want to apply for, that's okay too. So I want to make sure that I put that out there, because sometimes people see these grant programs and they feel discouraged because maybe their organization isn't in the right place. That's okay too. There are plenty of ways for you to engage, whether it's with your state broadband officer, maybe other organizations that are doing things. I want to make sure that there's room for you. And then finally, I do want to acknowledge, as much as we're in this moment because of all of the work people have done decades before us, we have to actually co-create with the people who are doing, whether it's deployment or digital equity programs. We have to actually co-create and be architects of this digital equity idea, the society that we want. So don't wait for it to be someone else's problem, someone else's work. Think about how we can actually make these things a reality with the people who are getting funding. So I say, get in touch with your state broadband office, make sure that you're finding partners in your community, make sure that you're finding partners that you actually jive with, because there's no need for you to get into a partnership that discourages you from doing good work. So.
Thank you, Francella. Amanda.
I'm going to say 2 things: brag and listen. So brag, I work for a national organization. One of the most fun parts of my job is that when state and local folks tell me about really cool things they're doing, I get to lift it up and brag about it. So please do not be shy about reaching out to me and telling me something you're proud of that your organization is doing, even if it doesn't have federal funding attached to it. And I've put my contact information in the chat. It'll also be on the slides that you receive later. But listen. Right. So in 2012, I was working for a small immigrant serving organization. I had a very frustrating conversation with an older white guy who lectured me on how immigrants were behind on technology. And I said, that doesn't reflect at all what I'm seeing and hearing. And we did a survey of 118 immigrants about how they were using cell phones and mobile technology. And we put that data side by side with data from the Pew Internet and American Life Project. And we were able to demonstrate that immigrants were actually using cell phones and mobile technology in more creative and more innovative ways and at higher rates than US born Americans, right? And so listen to your community about things they're doing. What are they doing with WhatsApp groups? What are they doing running online businesses? Are they using TikTok for public education of community members around, hot topics, right? Listen there and then take your cue from community members as you think about digital skills and digital opportunities for Latino communities. And I'll end it there.
Well said, Amanda. Well, on behalf of the Aspen Institute and Advisory Board at the Latino Society Program, I would like to thank Francella and Amanda for joining this discussion on federal funding opportunities for digital equity and workforce readiness. Also thanking Juan Otero for sharing his insights and setting the tone for today's conversation, and our gratefulness to Comcast NBC Universal for their generous support of our work. Thank you to everyone for tuning in into today's discussion. We hope this masterclass gave you a better understanding on the resources available to advance digital equity and workforce development in your communities, which are true foundations for America's future competitiveness and prosperity. We hope that you got inspired to apply to some of these federal funding opportunities. And as I mentioned earlier, we will provide a video recording of today's webinar in the coming days so that you can rewatch or share it with your networks. And please do amplify this content. We need anyone in the community to be aware and to understand what is at stake. You will also be prompted to complete a brief survey at the close of the webinar to provide feedback on today's discussion. So please complete it. It's going to help us make a better job in the future. And with that, we conclude our Digital Success Masterclass. Please have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.